Hello, I'm Ghinwa Hakim and you are watching the Arabic Hour. On today's program we have physician, author, and activist Dr. Alice Rothchild, co-founder of American Jews for a Just Peace, Boston, here to tell us more about her recent fact-finding trip to Israel-Palestine.
And for me, the big thing that we need to look at is the issue of Zionism. Now, Zionism as a sort of religious concept that when the Messiah comes, the Jews will be safe and there'll be some homeland, is a religious concept. Then there is the political national concept that says Jews have a right to have a home of their own, and they've placed it in historic Palestine. So I think the big problem for me with Zionism is that it's actually a nationalistic movement. And it's a movement that says that it's okay for Jews to be privileged over another people in the country where they live.
Our guest today is a familiar face to the Arabic Hour. Dr. Rothchild developed an interest in progressive politics in the 1960s and 70s, starting with campus opposition to the Vietnam War and moving on to her discovery of feminism and health reform movements while in medical school and residency. In 1997, through her involvement in the Boston Workmen's Circle, a progressive secular Jewish organization, Alice turned much of her non-medical focus to the understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and its relationship to U.S. foreign policy and American Jewry. She co-founded and co-chairs Visions of Peace with Justice in Israel-Palestine, now American Jews for a Just Peace Boston, and co-organized the AJJP Health and Human Rights Project. She is author of the book Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, Stories of Jewish and Palestinian Trauma and Resilience. Dr. Rothchild, thank you so much for joining us again at the Arabic Hour. It's great to have you back here.
It's good to be here.
Thanks. So actually, recently in the news, President Obama has just gone on his trip as president for the first time to Israel. I'd like to explore that a little bit with you and see what you thought of, the speeches that he made. Of course, he was still strong-handed on the need for Israeli security and U.S. backing Israeli security at all times, but he did something a little bit different this time, and he did speak about Israelis looking at the occupation through the eyes of a Palestinian. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, on the one hand, I was very disappointed in his, we stand with Israel, we've got your back, we're your best friends standard, which is the standard talk that American presidents give. But I was also happy to see that he could give a talk to young Israeli students and open their eyes a little bit to the fact that there are Palestinians who have lives that are full of yearning and full of the oppression of the occupation. And I thought this was a real different kind of talk for a president to give, and very useful for the students as well as the world to hear.
So soon after we received the groundbreaking news that Israel issued an apology to Turkey. So that, may have had something to do with President Obama's pressure on that situation to restore relations. Do you think that after this trip we're going to see some more pressure on Israel to behave or to act in a certain way?
I don't know. I'm very impressed with the long-standing military and political relations between the U.S. and Israel and the lack of progress in the peace process, or the lack of peace process. So I think words are easy. I want to see some action. I think that the settlement growth is the major stumbling block here to any movement forward. And the way I see it framed in the press, the Palestinians want their territory. They don't say this is occupied territory. The way that it's framed hasn't really changed. So I think we're going to have to see. I'm not very optimistic that political leaders are going to make the change. I think the change is going to come from the grassroots.
So by grassroots, what do you mean by that specifically?
Well, I think that if we look at what's going on in the region, that there's a long history of Israeli intransigence, of worsening occupation, of the lives of Palestinians getting more and more difficult and restricted, and that what we see in Palestine is a very powerful grassroots nonviolent resistance movement. And partly it's coming from the boycott, divestment, sanction call, and partly there's a whole a series of villages that are doing nonviolent popular resistance against the wall, against land confiscation. And we see the world, and particularly in Europe and in South Africa and also in the United States, opening their eyes and responding to what's happening on the ground. And I find that much more inspiring than President Obama coming and saying something that I could agree with for change on this topic. And I think sort of world pressure is going to be what changes. And also, as long as the U.S. is funding the occupation, it's not going to change. So there has to be pressure on U.S. Congress. There has to be a movement within international communities to call Israel to task on what its behavior is.
So you spoke about nonviolent resistance movements in Palestine. You yourself lead many delegations, and you go to Palestine frequently, your latest trip being in October of 2012. Can you tell us a little bit about what you witnessed firsthand while you're there on the ground with these protesters, with these movements?
Well, that was a very extraordinary trip because it was organized by the Dorothy Cotton Institute. And Dorothy Cotton worked with Martin Luther King as an educational director and has worked on civil rights and democracy issues in the United States and founded this institute to continue that work. So this was a trip that had a number of African American civil rights leaders dating back to King, plus younger people and other activists. And we went, led by Rabbi Brian Walt, to explore the nonviolent resistance movements and also to compare notes between these African American leaders and Palestinian leaders. So it was a phenomenal experience for me to bear witness to this and to be part of it. And we visited Nabi Saleh, Belin, and Budrus. And those are 3 villages where there are very active popular committees that do nonviolent resistance against the wall and against land confiscation. And the Five Broken Cameras is based on one of these. The movie Budrus is based on these towns as well. And the work that these people do, the fact that they're inspired by Martin Luther King and by Gandhi, their deep commitment to nonviolent resistance was really inspirational and I think changes the conversation. The one event that we went to was a Friday demonstration in Nabi Saleh. And there was a New York Times article recently about Nabi Saleh, which I thought was groundbreaking. I mean, the things that Ben Ehrenreich discussed were things that I witnessed, and the people he talked about, I stayed in their homes, I slept in their beds, I ate food with them, I walked the streets with them, I got tear gassed with them. I mean, these are people that we all met, and to see it in the New York Times was pretty extraordinary. So that's what I mean by nonviolent resistance.
So, tear gas. Can you, tell us a little bit about what these protesters and what you faced in terms of Israeli forces' reaction to these nonviolent protests?
Well, there's sort of a dance that happens during these protests. They happen on Friday after prayer, and generally people are marching, often with signs, chanting, singing. When we were there were signs quoting Martin Luther King, which was very powerful. And whatever the people who are marching are defending, they march towards the fence or towards their agricultural land or whatever the protest is about. And at some point, the Israeli soldiers start throwing tear gas, firing rubber bullets, spraying the crowd with this skunk material, which is a foul-smelling thing that comes out of this big white truck. And then at some point, young boys start throwing rocks and playing cat and mouse with the soldiers, and this goes on for hours. And when the tear gas gets really thick, people retreat up the hill and they regroup, and then they march down. And it's a kind of dance between the occupier and the occupied. And we had endless discussions about whether throwing rocks was nonviolent, and it was a fascinating conversation. It was the way that the African Americans and the Palestinians were really talking about what does nonviolence mean. What I learned from Palestinian youth is that picking up a rock or some dirt is really an act of defiance, that from their point of view, a rock is not going to hurt a tank or a very well-armed vehicle, but it's a symbol of saying, this land is mine, I own this, and I'm not going to let you have it. And so we had endless debates about that. But that's what happens on these weekly dance between the resistors and the soldiers. And the thing that's very painful for me is to see young Israeli soldiers who are so dehumanized and brutalized by what they're being asked to do, able to sort of aim at young people, at teenagers, at children, and throw tear gas right in their face and fire rubber bullets at them. I mean, everybody is brutalized by this experience. And so you get to see it real up close and personal because it's happening right in front of your eyes.
So actually in the news recently, there was the story, during President Obama's visit, there was a protest protesting his presence and his meeting.
Was that in E1?
In Israel, yes. And so there were about 30 school children, boys mostly, that were arrested Do you see young people being arrested? I know that, you know, in the past you've read health and human rights delegations, and you speak about the effects and the traumatic effects on the young children of Palestine. Can you discuss, you know, what an event like that has on the youth of Palestine?
Right. Well, one of the things that, particularly talking with the mothers of these children, which I've done, is that Palestinian children are often basically robbed of their childhoods, that there's a very bad track record in terms of Israelis arresting young kids, 10, 12, 13-year-old kids, and treating them very brutally, not allowing them access to lawyers, really traumatizing them in ways that have long-term consequences. One of the statistics I learned that I found really fascinating is that half of suicide bombers, Palestinian suicide bombers, had their homes demolished when they were children. So that the trauma to the children is very major. And this is what happens. It's a struggle where the young people are at the forefront. And I talk with mothers who are saying, they don't want their children to get hurt, they're terrified, but they can't stop them from doing this. And they're also proud of them because they're preserving their dignity and they're being resilient. And resilience within the Palestinian family is really critical for survival under occupation. So it's a very complicated situation.
So you mentioned earlier about the boycott, divestment, sanctions. Last time you were actually on the Arabic Hour, we spoke extensively about that. Have there been any changes in the BDS movement in the Boston area and throughout the United States? And how is that affecting the grassroots movement in general towards the end of the occupation?
Well, the boycott, divestment, sanction movement is a creative grassroots movement, so it's always changing. So things that are going on in Boston, we had a campaign to de-shelve Sabra hummus at the Harvest Co-op. And although the referendum never happened for a variety of reasons that we could talk about endlessly, they did take it off their shelves because people weren't buying it. There's a whole Veolia campaign. Veolia is a major international company that provides transportation systems and does some of the transportation systems in Boston. And they also have the Jewish-only buses in the West Bank, so they're a target. There's a new campaign against SodaStream that's taking off in Boston. SodaStream is ecologically a fabulous company. They make the spritzers so you can have seltzer water without buying more plastic bottles. But the company does their production in the occupied territory. So there's a big campaign against SodaStream that's growing in Boston. And then there's the TIA-CREF campaign, which now is being spearheaded by Jewish Voice for Peace, by Grassroots International, I think by the U.S. campaign. There's a whole list of organizations that have signed on. And basically, TIA-CREF is a major financial and retirement company. And so people like me, doctors and teachers and social workers, people who consider themselves sort of interested in the social well-being of the world, often have this as their retirement. And they have a socially responsible retirement fund, and some of the companies that they're invested in profit from the occupation, like Caterpillar, I think Motorola, there's a whole list, Northrop Grumman. They're not necessarily Israeli companies, they're US companies, and so we're calling on TIA-CREF to divest from companies that are involved in supporting the occupation in their socially responsible fund. So they actually pulled out of Caterpillar, so that was a big deal. So there's lots and lots of stuff happening, and in the fall, American Public Health Association is coming to Boston, and we're going to be doing a lot of work with the TIA-CREF issue, because a lot of people who are in the public health world have TIA-CREF. So there's just an enormous amount happening, and nationally and internationally as well.
I think something that's very interesting that's been happening is the movements that's happening across college campuses. The youth movements across colleges have become more unified in their approach towards BDS and other kinds of boycotts. Particularly a cultural boycott of Israel, I think, is something that is attracting the youth when artists and lecturers refuse to perform or speak in Israel. How do you think that the cultural boycott will tie into the economic boycotts?
Well, first of all, I want to just address why this is so attractive to college youth. And I think what we're seeing is that college students really want to support democratic countries. They want to support human rights. And what they see when they look at the behavior of the Israeli government is that there's some really tough contradictions. And so they're sort of much more interested in saying, okay, you want to be democracy? Then we're going to call you on that. If you're going to defend human rights, we're going to call you on that. And so behavior that was once acceptable because we all love Israel behavior is no longer considered acceptable. So that's why there's this general appeal within the college campuses. I think the cultural boycott is very important because the cultural boycott affects the reputation of the country. And I think isolating the Israeli policies and affecting the reputation of Israel is part of sort of shaming it into behaving better. And that's been a very powerful aspect to this whole thing. And I think, you know, that you need all the different forces coming together. It's not like one thing is going to work. It's changing the conversation, it's changing the framing, it's changing what we ignore. And you know, I think that's the direction we're heading in. It's going to be a long struggle, but it's the direction we're heading in.
So as, you know, as these groups within the United States and within Israel itself, these youth groups are becoming a little bit more willing to shame Israel into behaving. We see that the Israeli government is becoming more and more right-wing and implementing policies such as segregated buses and, you know, things that are, you know, highways only for Palestinians, highways for Israel. How are the youth and these groups going to eventually influence the government, or do you see that happening?
So just in terms of phrasing and framing, when you say highways for Israel, I think we have to say highways for Jewish Israelis, and remember that 20% of Israelis are Palestinian, and you know, our language is so befuddled, and it's really important for us to be really clear on how we talk about this. So in terms of how we're going to impact, I don't think there's like one way. I think it's a whole changing of it's reaching a tipping point where certain things are no longer acceptable. So for instance, you know, after all the pogroms and the Holocaust and all the Jewish trauma and suffering, it's very understandable why the world was filled with guilt, because they didn't do all the things they were supposed to do, but also why people would support a Jewish state to sort of make up for all of this. But the fact of the matter is that the Jewish state, I think, has not been good for the Jewish people, and it hasn't been good for the people around it on which they built their state. So I think this is about changing the framing, and that's the direction we're going to have to move in.
So what do you see for the future of the state of Israel and in relation with the state of Palestine? Is that a two-state solution for you, one-state solution? How do you see the future?
Well, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know. I'm very, very worried about the direction that the Israeli government has taken, basically since inception. I mean, although I understand why it was formed the way it was formed, I think it's important to remember that there was a lot of opposition to the Zionist movement before the State of Israel was founded from Jews, and that I think the Holocaust changed that conversation. But then there were decisions made once the state was formed, like putting the entire Palestinian population in Israel under military rule from 1949 to 1965, that set this up as a country that could not really be a democracy. So I see the direction we've gone in is really based on the foundations that were created at the beginning and are actually sort of predictable, okay? So at this point, what we see is a country that is very much dominated by the right wing, that is dominated by the religious right that claims territory even beyond the 67 borders, a very powerful settler movement that is really holding the entire country hostage, although I think they're willing hostages. And increasingly, there are such deep contradictions that, you know, I heard Diana Buttu, who is a PLO negotiator and a human rights lawyer, she said that, you know, the Israelis have basically overstepped themselves at this point, that it's gotten so outrageous that even people who never would question the policies of Israel are beginning to question. So when I'm there on the ground, I don't see, you know, an Israeli state that's within the 67 borders. I see an Israeli state that actually goes all the way to the Jordan River, because Israel controls the Jordan Valley, and it controls Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank. And then there are these little enclaves, or some people call them Bantustans, you know, there are various words for it, where Palestinians live. And so in some ways, for me, the two-state solution of the two-state idea or fantasy really died a long time ago because of the behavior of the Israeli government. As long as there's this rapidly expanding settler movement, these are Jewish settlers living and colonizing in occupied territory, you can't have a two-state solution if you're gobbling up one of the states that's supposed to be there. So I think we're at a place where we have basically in actual life a greater Israel with little Bantustans. And so the question is that the struggle is now about civil rights and human rights and how to frame this honestly rather than using language that maybe was appropriate in '93 with Oslo, but really doesn't reflect the reality of what's going on. And I think one of the really sad things is that, Israelis are not evil people. There's a hugely secular population. There are people who are living in Tel Aviv just like they live in San Francisco. And most people are just done with thinking about this. So that it's the apathy that's the major problem for much of the Israeli population. And also, then the government is moving so right-wing that it's just dangerous for everybody.
You know, in terms of painting a realistic picture, one thing that the Israeli government declares is that, most of its actions are in the name of the security of the Israeli state. Do you see that as accurate, or do you see, the word security just being thrown as a cover on everything? Are the checkpoints for security? Are the settlements for security? How do you see that framework?
Well, security is the magic excuse for everything, and I think that it's part of the framing that's really not an accurate framing. So, if the settlements were about security, why would you be building more settlements in an area that then you have to defend because you built more settlements? It's a totally ridiculous argument, and if you really wanted to have security, you would make a just peace with the people that are offended by your behavior. I think that the policies of the Israeli government actually make them much less secure, because you have, for instance, in Gaza, where there's this horrendous siege, a fairly desperate population, a huge illegal tunnel market, because that's the only way people can survive, you're going to make those folks feel more likely able to negotiate with Israel when you've box them in this really dehumanizing situation. I mean, this isn't how you build security. So I just think the security is a false cover for control and taking over more land and doing things that, for me as a Jewish person and as a US citizen who's actually committed to democracy, just feels like an anathema. I just can't support this.
So are you planning any future trips and delegations to Palestine?
So I work with a group called American Jews for a Just Peace and also Jewish Voice for Boston. And we have a health and human rights project going in June. So you can go on the websites and get an application. So we do have a 2-week trip going. And what we do is we explore meeting with different Jewish Israelis and Palestinians in Israel, in the West Bank, learning about human rights struggles, learning about civil rights struggles, learning about the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, and really helping people to see what are the realities on the ground. What is it like to wait at checkpoints? What is it like to have a separate road systems? What is it like to live in a little village that's completely surrounded by a wall? I mean, we go and do all of these things, and so the people who come on these delegations are usually incredibly moved by the experience and also have their eyes open to a reality that most Americans don't see. And then we also do, the people who are medical people also do some work with Physicians for Human Rights Israel, which is an Israeli human rights organization, and also with the Palestinian Medical Relief Society. So we actually go provide health care, see patients, and that's another way to really learn about what life is like for people, because for instance, I see a woman who has a breast lump and I want her to have a mammogram and see a breast surgeon. Well, there are not enough mammograms and there's too many checkpoints between the mammogram and her, and the surgeon is probably, too hard to get to. So it's a political negotiation to get health care. And the system is totally dysfunctional because it's so boxed into little pieces and people need permits to get from one place to another place. And the Ministry of Health has one system and the NGOs have another. I mean, you really get a sense of what is the price of this occupation for people who are living there, and how do they make it day by day? And it's very eye-opening.
So do a lot of people that go on these delegations come back to their local homes and do you feel like they become more involved? You know, are they changed after they come back?
Well, I mean, that's the main reason to do these delegations, is to help change people. And it depends on the delegation, but a lot of people come back very energized, join organizations, get involved, work on the BDS struggle in a way they didn't before, write about it, do report backs to their communities, speak in their temples and their churches. I mean, people do come back and do things. I mean, it's never enough. We're trying to develop a more supportive system so people can share photos and make it easy for people. But that's what the job is. That's what our job is as Americans. Yeah.
So thank you, Alice. After this short break, we're going to come back and talk about your latest project.
Okay, great.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
How do you understand history? Who controls the message? Is the media muzzled, lazy, confused, manipulated? How do you create personal and political change? I invite you to join me in exploring one of the most pressing and complex issues of our day.
It's one of those villages, the 400 and some, that in 1948 were totally demolished.
In 1967, all of a sudden, I would call it the transformation from childhood to hell.
Oh, I am totally homeless. When I go into our home in Jordan, I feel I'm safe. This is my home. But being in the country of Jordan, they don't want us.
This can't go on for much longer. People's eyes are beginning to open to what Israel's doing. And I don't think you can really justify any longer the continued denial of freedom or lack of equality.
Confused? Still don't get it? You're not alone. What if you could understand this challenging story? What if you could act on your understanding? Please support Voices Across the Divide, a film that documents powerful family stories and sheds a new light on the Israel-Palestine conflict. My name is Alice Rothchild, and I was born in 1948 in Boston. I'm an American Jew, interestingly enough born the same year that the State of Israel was founded. My parents were first-generation Americans who instilled in us a sense that Jews were a distinct and often endangered tribe. This Jewishness soon became grounded in our love for Israel. But as I grew up, I realized I had never actually met an Arab before, and I only knew one side of this complex historical narrative. I also began to understand that the victors in history are often the authors as well. This understanding compelled me to actively search for the stories I had missed, traveling to Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. I wrote a book about these experiences and began interviewing Palestinians in the United States, learning about the enormous commonalities between Arabs and Jews. I also had to confront the trauma and fear that pulses in my Jewish DNA. The idea for the film was born. The invisible voices that are the other part of my story compel me to speak out, to act, and to share these stories in order to create a positive future for all of us. Right now, your access to information about this conflict is shaped by powerful forces and organizations. To be an informed citizen and a peacemaker, you deserve to know more. By supporting this effort, you can be part of a group of motivated folks with curiosity, empathy, and courage to explore a forgotten people's history. The time is urgent. For over 65 years, the conflict has dragged on. Palestinians continue to suffer from occupation, checkpoints, restrictions of movement, home demolitions. Israeli society is bearing the fruits of being an occupying power, and in fact has turned its back on this conflict. The American Jewish establishment and the U.S. Congress march largely with the Israeli right. The U.S. sends $3 billion in military aid to Israel every year. Join me to be part of a peaceful, grassroots international effort grounded in mutual respect, understanding, and political activism.
So we just saw a clip from your latest project, Voices Across the Divide. What was the inspiration for making this film?
Well, it's a kind of interesting story. I wrote a book called Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, which was basically my journey into this whole world, because I came from a very traditional Jewish place, and it's been quite a journey. And then I started, in the book, I tell stories of both Jewish Israelis and Palestinians and really try to give an on-the-ground, intimate look at what's happening. So then I started book touring with my book, because that's how you get books out. And I found every time I would speak where there were Palestinians in the audience, they would interrupt me and want to tell me what happened to me, what my mother, So I thought, I should write a book about the stories the Palestinians tell me, because this is really interesting stuff and most people don't know about it. So I was in Detroit book touring, and I had to set up some interviews, and it was just like people who knew people, nothing, no fancy leaders or anything like that. And I started doing these interviews, and this cameraman found out from San Francisco that I was doing this, and he said, "This should be a movie," and I'm like, right, like, fly me to the moon. So he arrived and started taping the interviews. And I came back to Boston with these incredible, 2-hour interviews, people pouring their hearts out, lots of really important historical stuff, family stuff. And I'd also done in New York an event which was a Nakba event. Now the Nakba means catastrophe. It's the Palestinian experience of 1948. And in this event, people who had actually lived in Palestine in 48 got up and had 20 minutes to tell me, a Jewish woman, their Nakba story. So it's this very powerful public speak out kind of event. So I had all of that on video as well. And I came back and thought someone else is going to make the movie and I'll go write my book. And gradually realized that I had to make this movie, and I found a supportive film professor who said we can do this, and then I realized I really need to find an actual filmmaker, so I found Sharon Mullally of Extended Play. It's a film company in Philadelphia, and so we've been working on this project. So I interviewed more people in Boston and then started trying to assemble this, and basically the movie is the story of the Israel-Palestine conflict as told through the voices of Palestinians who lived it. And I focus on what happened in 1948, what life was like before, during, and after, and then the consequences of that, and then what happened in 1967, because those are 2 times when there were major expulsions of Palestinians, and so that's important history for people to understand. And then I have some people who their parents had already left, or their parents were being educated or working in, let's say, Kuwait, and so they have their story, and all of these people ultimately ended up in the United States. So I use all the bits and pieces of these stories, add the family photos, get historical footage. The UN actually gave me 2 hours of free UNRWA footage from 48, which was an incredible gift. So it's a lot of borrowing, stealing, and begging of photos. And then we weave it all together to create this very powerful documentary. And it's very close to done, which is why we have this fundraising campaign to help us get over the top. And it's going to have an original score by Christine Karm from the Berklee College of Music. So it's going to be, I think, a very powerful and useful film to have out there to show on TV, film festivals, community organizations. I think that it's going to have, universities, it's going to have a lot of places where it could be useful. I also am a deep believer that the personal narrative is extremely powerful, that people have their political framing and that's how they understand the world, but then you get someone who's telling their own story, and you can't say their story isn't a real story, it's their story, and I think that's one of the ways to change people's minds.
So what have you heard, if you can share with us, about the lives of Palestinians before 48? We always hear about what's happening now and about the conflict and the poverty and all of that. There was life in 48. So what was that like?
Right. Well, I grew up in a home where the Jews were a people without a land, and Palestine was a land without a people. That's a very famous quote. And when I was 14 and went to Israel with my family, there were no Palestinians. We didn't even know they existed. So that's sort of where many people start. So the thing that I found really moving was that these older Palestinians who had been living in Jaffa, in Jerusalem, in Ain Karam, in all these different places in historic Palestine, they wanted to tell us about their lives then. And so some of them were wealthy. They had huge orange groves and olive groves and, you know, a lot of business adventures. One guy, his father was the distributor for BP oil company. There was a lot of culture. There were universities. It was a very vibrant and rich place to be. There was also a huge rural population, and, you know, they were small villages, very bucolic looking, a lot of olive trees, a lot of citrus trees, but an active population that was doing quite well as a, you know, outpost of the Ottoman Empire. But they were, you know, they've been repeatedly colonized. You know, the British and then the Israelis are the more recent ones. But there was a vibrant cities. Haifa was a major city. You know, it's not a land without a people. It's very, very clear to me. This idea that people, Jews and Arabs, have been fighting for thousands of years is just a myth. And so this leads us into the question of, so what happened? And for me, the big thing that we need to look at is the issue of Zionism. Now, Zionism as a sort of religious concept that when the Messiah comes, the Jews will be safe and there'll be some homeland, is a religious concept. Then there is the political national concept that says Jews have a right to have a home of their own, and they've placed it in historic Palestine. And for me, the big problem, and, you know, when that concept in the late 1880s came into flowering with Herzl, you know, most Jews were opposed to it, and there was a lot of conflict about the whole, what was going to happen with this issue. And it was the Holocaust that was the turning point, that because of world guilt, that really made it become into fruition. So I think the big problem for me with Zionism is that it's actually a nationalistic movement. And it's a movement that says that it's okay for Jews to be privileged over another people in the country where they live. And I think that's where the whole thing falls apart. You cannot be a democracy and a Jewish state. I mean, you just can't, because you have, right now we have, what, 22% of the population who are second-class citizens. And it just leads to all sorts of bad things that are the things that are happening now. So what I, you know, particularly when I talk to young people, what we really agree upon is that Judaism is a religion, and it has all sorts of power and beauty and force, but that Judaism has been hijacked by Zionism, and that it's important to separate the two. And so for a lot of young people, they're reclaiming their Jewishness, but they're separating it from Zionism because they're very unhappy with the behavior of the State of Israel. And I think that's a very important new concept that's really becoming more and more convincing to people.
So when you're interviewing, you know, these older Palestinians, do you feel a sense that they're excited that you're wanting to share your story coming from, you know, a Jewish American background? Do they feel that you know, you're the first one listening to their story, or?
Well, it depended. For a number of people, I think I was the first one who wasn't, you know, a member of the family who said, "Tell me what happened," and then just got quiet and listened. So it was emotionally very powerful for me, and so. For some of the older people, I think it was a real sort of opening up of hidden wounds kind of experience, and I think it was powerful for all of us.
Did you face any resistance from the Palestinian community, the Jewish community, about your film, about sharing these experiences and these stories?
Well, you know, one of the things that's very tricky is that I have to be very respectful that I'm sharing somebody else's story that I feel like is connected with my story. And there were some people that I interviewed who felt very comfortable with me, but their families didn't really feel comfortable because they didn't know me and they didn't know what I was going to do with this. So there were some moments that we had to negotiate, or one person whose family wouldn't release family photos because they're like, we don't want a Jewish woman telling our story. And I fully understand and respect that. But I think part of the work is to get to a place where we can trust each other and be able to work together, and that I can be a vehicle for the stories to get public, and I can also be sort of the friendly guide that takes people who are a little nervous about this whole topic into the topic, because I'm not Arab and I, you know, went on this journey, and I want to invite people to come with me. And since we live in this very, you know, racist society, I might be able to be helpful in that conversation. So, you know, that's part of the work that we all need to do.
So you just said something very interesting about shared experience. You know, their story is tied to your story. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, one of the things that I realized as I worked on this, I always asked the longer interviews, I would ask, what do you know about the Holocaust? And tell me when you first met a Jew or an Israeli. And I really tried to get into people's inner thoughts on this stuff. And one of the very powerful quotes that's in my film is one of the interviewers said, you know, the Holocaust is not my problem. You know, we're not to blame. We just bore the consequences, basically. But I had to come to grips with the fact that this has become part of my history because it is part of the story of this conflict. And so as I learned about this, I realized that the Nakba, similarly, has also become part of my story. That what happened with the founding of the state, which is, quote, my story, is intimately intertwined with what happened to Palestinians. And that unless we both recognize each other's stories, we're not going to get anywhere. And that's part of, you know, reaching across the divide. That's part of what this movie is about.
So you said you're almost done with the movie. When can we expect?
We are planning to be done mid-August.
What's happening between now and August for completion of the film?
Well, it's very exciting. We just launched what's called an Indiegogo campaign. It's a lot like Kickstarter. It's a crowdsourcing campaign. And so there's a website that people can go to and get more information about the project and support it. And you know, there are all sorts of little rewards and big rewards if you want to give more money. But that's our current big push right now.
And what about the Jewish resistance, if any, to the film?
So I think the good news is that the Jewish community is not monolithic. So there's sort of a mainstream Jewish community that is going to be very uncomfortable with a movie like my movie. There's also an increasingly, particularly amongst young Jews, openness to hearing this stuff and to being educated about this stuff. So I live in a very supportive community with a lot of Jews who are willing to support me. We don't represent the majority, obviously, and for some, I think, Jews, this is going to be extremely threatening. But I think it's absolutely important for us as Jews in the United States to face this history, to come to terms with it, and to be able to speak to each other about it without everybody, you know, demolishing each other and yelling at each other, which is what currently often happens. But it's part of challenging the power of what I would see the more right-wing element of the Jewish community. So, you know, again, it's a very diverse community, and that's the good news.
Dr. Rothschild, thank you so much for joining us at the Arabic Hour. It's been an amazing experience to have you back here, and we certainly value your perspective.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
So to all of our viewers, look forward to Dr. Rothschild's latest project, the film Voices Across the Divide.
Confused? Still don't get it? You're not alone. What if you could understand this challenging story? What if you could act on your understanding? Please support Voices Across the Divide, a film that documents powerful family stories and sheds a new light on the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Stay with us. We'll be back with music after this short program ID.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
دائم الخضرة يا قلبي وإن بان بعيني الأسى دائم الثورة يا قلبي وإن صارت صباحاتي مسا جئت في زمن الجزر جئت في عز التعب رشاش عنف وغضب إني اخترتك يا وطني حبا وطوعية إني اخترتك يا وطني سرا وعلنية إني اخترتك يا وطني فليتنكر لي زمني ما دمت ستذكرني يا وطني الرائع يا وطني.
are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Thank you so much for joining us. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghanwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience. The American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors. The Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride. And by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.